Someone in your group just died. Not a fight, not a lion. They were breathing one night. By morning, they weren't. Here's the part that should stop you cold. You don't do what literally every other animal on this planet does with its dead. Walk away, forget, move on. You dig a hole. You rub the body with red ochre until it's stained. You spend hundreds of hours hand-carving thousands of tiny ivory beads to bury with a child who will never wear a single one, next to a spear he will never throw. No chimpanzee has ever done this. No elephant, no wolf, no dolphin. In the entire history of life on this planet, no other species has ever done this. Somewhere in the freezing dark of the last ice age, a species looked at a corpse and quietly decided the story wasn't finished. So what flipped that switch? Here's the detail that makes it stranger. This wasn't one campfire superstition that happened to catch on. Separated by oceans, mountains, and tens of thousands of years with zero contact with each other, nearly every human culture ever studied arrived at some version of the same impossible idea. That something unseen is watching. That the dead aren't entirely gone. That the world runs on more than what you can touch and measure. That's either the strangest coincidence our species has ever produced, or it isn't a coincidence at all. Today we're going into the actual evidence, the archaeology, the psychology, the anthropology, to find out how a species that started out mostly trying not to get eaten ended up inventing gods, spirits, and an afterlife. And the honest answer isn't one lightning bolt moment. It's a handful of very ordinary features of the human brain, stacked on top of each other, that made believing in the invisible almost impossible to avoid. Look at an electrical outlet on the wall, 2 holes and a ground socket, and your brain instantly renders a tiny, startled face staring back at you. That's not a coincidence, and it's not a flaw. It's a setting. Your brain runs a system built to spot other minds, predators, rivals, anything that might be watching you, and evolution tuned it to be trigger-happy on purpose. Rustling grass has 2 explanations, wind or a leopard. Guess wind and you're wrong about a leopard, you're dead. Guess leopard and you're wrong about the wind, you just look a little jumpy. One mistake costs you your life, the other costs you a bit of pride, so natural selection built a brain that would rather be embarrassed 1,000 times than eaten once. Cognitive scientists call this a hyperactive agency detection device, and while researchers still argue over exactly how it works, it's one of the most influential explanations for where religious thinking begins. A brain that's constantly scanning for invisible minds doesn't switch off during a thunderstorm. It doesn't switch off when someone dies, either. Thunder isn't just weather to a mind like that. It's someone doing something on purpose. It's the same reflex that makes you see a face in your toast, or feel like the universe sent you a sign when the person you were just thinking about happens to call. Once your brain decides an event has an author, the next question writes itself. Who? Now add dreams. You have no concept of REM sleep, no neuroscience, no framework at all for what a dream even is. All you have is the experience. Your dead grandmother, standing right there, talking, looking exactly as alive as she ever did. For a prehistoric mind, my brain is replaying stored memory isn't an available explanation. It hasn't been invented yet. The simplest available explanation is that some part of her is still out there, and she just visited you. The 19th century anthropologist Edward Tyler built an entire theory of religion's origin on almost exactly this. That the idea of a soul, something that survives the body, starts as the most reasonable explanation for a genuinely strange experience that people in every culture, every generation, have always had. A brain already primed to detect invisible agents, combined with a species that dreams vividly about people who are no longer alive, is a species that's already halfway to inventing spirits, without anyone sitting down and deciding to. That's the theory of how it might have started in the mind. Here's the evidence that it actually happened, written in ochre, bone, and ivory. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, archaeologists found chunks of red ochre deliberately engraved with cross-hatched patterns, over 70,000 years old. Symbolic marks with no survival function at all. Neanderthals, separately, were digging graves for their dead by at least 40,000 years ago at sites like Shanidar Cave in Iraq and La Pharisee in France. One famous burial at Shanidar was long believed to include flowers laid over the body. Newer pollen analysis suggests burrowing bees are the more likely explanation. Even the story of ancient belief keeps getting rewritten. The burial itself, though, holds up. About 40,000 years ago, in a cave in Germany, someone spent hundreds of hours carving a piece of mammoth ivory into a figure with a human body and the head of a lion, a being that has never existed and never could. The British Museum points to it as the earliest known sign that humans held religious beliefs at all, proof that the human imagination had learned to build things that live only inside the mind. And at Sungir in Russia, around 34,000 years ago, two children were buried together wearing roughly 10,000 individually hand-carved ivory beads between them. Beadwork that, across the site's burials, researchers estimate took thousands of hours to produce. You do not spend that kind of time dressing someone who is simply, permanently gone. Here's where it gets genuinely strange. For decades, the assumption was simple. Humans settled down, started farming, built up surplus food, and only then had the spare time to invent religion. Then, in southeastern Turkey, archaeologists uncovered Göbekli Tepe, massive carved stone pillars, some over 10 tons, arranged in circles, dated to around 9,600 BCE. That's roughly 11,600 years ago, about 6,000 years before Stonehenge. The people who built it hadn't invented farming yet. No pottery, no metal tools, no permanent villages. Just hunter-gatherers, hauling multi-ton stones into place for a structure that, as far as anyone can tell, nobody ever actually lived in. Feeding and organizing the crowds needed to build something like that would have taken serious, sustained planning. Archaeologist Klaus Schmidt argued the sequence ran backwards from what everyone had assumed. The gathering place came first, farming came after, because you needed a reliable way to feed everyone who kept showing up for the ritual. Belief may not have been civilization's reward. At Göbekli Tepe, it looks a lot more like civilization's trigger. The last piece is the most practical one. A shared belief that something unseen is watching. That a total stranger can still be trusted, still be held to the same invisible rules, still be punished for cheating you, even if no human catches them. Let people cooperate at a scale that family ties alone never could. Human social groups tend to run into trouble past a certain size, often cited around 150 people. Once everyone can no longer personally track everyone else's reputation. Shared gods, shared rituals, and shared taboos were some of the earliest tools that let human groups grow past that number without falling apart. That's not so different from what a currency, a legal system, or a government does today. A different kind of invisible authority, backing the same basic promise. I'll trust you because we both answer to something bigger than either of us. So go back to that grave. The beads, the ochre, the spear that would never be thrown. It wasn't foolishness, and it wasn't a species too primitive to understand death. If anything, it was the opposite. A mind so good at spotting patterns, so wired for connection, so unwilling to let the people it loved simply stop mattering, that it built an entire invisible world just to keep them in it. That brain is still sitting behind your eyes right now. It's why an empty house at night can feel like it's being watched. It's why grief still makes people talk out loud to someone who isn't there anymore. You didn't inherit superstition. You inherited the exact same machinery that once looked at a body by a dying fire 40,000 years ago and decided, against all the available evidence, that this couldn't possibly be the whole story. A stone temple older than farming. A brain that builds ghosts out of static and dreams. If that's not enough to make you rethink what primitive actually means, I don't know what is. There's a lot more like this buried in the last 300,000 years than any textbook ever covers. Stick around, the next one's coming.